we too often place so much emphasis on success that failure actually becomes something that can be crippling to us if we don't manage it well. So I would say to people, it's important to understand you can face your failures without negatively labeling yourself. You don't want to fail, but you don't have to label yourself negatively just because it happens. The stigma regarding mental illness, in a manner of speaking, is a stigma against failure because at its core is the fundamental belief that if a person cannot meet a certain level of natural success or a certain level of societal success, then not only are they somehow lacking in qualities, but that they also deserve that type of ridicule. And I would say ultimately, I think the healthiest attitude is own your flaws. You don't have to deny that you have flaws, but at the same time, society should destigmatize having them so that if you do have a flaw, you feel the drive, you develop the drive to work on it. And if you can't change it, then that's not your fault.
Stories and Stanza is a podcast exploring creativity, resilience, and the transformative power of human stories. Through our two series, Between the Lines with creators and Fail With Me focusing on wellness and life's challenges, we bring you authentic conversations with inspiring voices from around the world. If you are drawn to meaningful dialogue that both comforts and challenges, follow us on YouTube or any podcast platform. Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of Stories and Stanza where I'm joined by our guest speaker, John, today. Hi John, welcome to Stories and Stanza.
Good afternoon, Abhra. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. For anyone who has joined Stories and Stanza for the first time, I'd like to say that today is an episode in the Fail With Me section, which is dedicated to mental health, wellness, emotional intelligence, awareness, a broad range of topics. And that started from a core theme of failure. What is it that we are calling as failure, labeling as failure, and what are they telling us so that we can be a better version of ourselves? That is how Fail With Me started. And today we will be exploring a lot of ideas in that space with John. So, John, for our listeners today, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Certainly. So I'm located in the southeast of Melbourne, Australia, and I operate a counselling practice. It's called Your Listener Counselling. I work with clients across the country remotely via video conference or telephone. I work with local clients. I work with a number of other organisations providing therapeutic intervention, and I also am greatly involved in media, which I love very much. I have a podcast called the Your Listener Podcast, and I speak on a number of different radio stations regularly. I write a regular blog, and I love to educate people about the mind and social psychology and mental health, and I love talking about how we can better understand the psychological workings, especially what's not often taught to us in school or in mainstream thought, and encourage people to think differently about ideas, to critically analyze, and to ultimately take responsibility to be the best versions of themselves that they can be. And it's a gift that keeps on giving, and I'm very lucky to be here.
Thank you so much, John. And what you said, it deeply speaks to me as well, because it is a very favorite area of this podcast to explore everything with curiosity. So when I started the discussion and I started the series called Fail With Me, and my idea was to be objective about failure. And I had no idea that this would connect with my listeners or it will connect with my guests. And now, 2 years down the line, I get more requests from people to be on the Fail With Me segment. And there are so many interesting ideas from speakers, writers, mental health workers on that space that it has organically grown and it has created such wealth of knowledge. So I'm totally on board with the idea that, what you are doing in this space. And we will, of course, hear from you throughout the conversation. So before I get started, I wanted to hear from you as to how does that idea of opening up about failure, or what we are labeling as fail with me here in this section, how does that speak with you? Because you have a wide range of experience working with people, and of course your personal experience as well. So it can be both, and I wanted to hear your perspective of failure and our ability to understand that and recover from that.
Certainly. I would argue that we still hold a lot of stigma with regards to failure. As human beings, we very much want to survive and we want to thrive. We have a natural inclination to want to achieve what we label as positive. And it has a valid basis. If any species or group of people is to survive in any way, then we have to strive towards what is going to help us. And so it's only natural for us to be attuned to and to be very motivated by what is helpful within our immediate social and natural environment. But what often does happen every day to a larger number of people is we misconstrue that reality as meaning that failure is inevitably bad, and we often become rather distressed by it. We often misattribute things that are really just learning experiences as failures. We too often place so much emphasis on success that failure actually becomes something that can be crippling to us if we don't manage it well. And something that I would love for people to understand more is that none of us is perfect, and we need to be willing to face our failures, but not so that we stigmatize them and not so that we become negative about them, but so that we recognize that there's capacity in failure. If we see a failure or something that we would like to be better about ourselves or about our environment, then we should use that as an opportunity to grow if we can, or if we can't change it, accept that we're doing the best that we can. Because to treat something that's not ideal or to treat an imperfection or a failure as an inevitable disaster, except in the situations where it clearly is, which are not anywhere near as numerous as the ones in which they're not, to treat it as that completely stifles our natural capacity to actually grow and learn from that incident. So I think we still have a long way to go all over the world in accepting that as human beings, being imperfect and failing in various small ways and some larger ways is actually just a part of the human experience. And we have to take responsibility as much as we can to be the best versions of ourselves. But at the same time, being nasty to ourselves because we failed or that we're not perfect is not going to help us, and it very much detracts from the beauty of life. So I would say to people, it's important to understand you can face your failures without negatively labeling yourself. You don't want to fail, but you don't have to label yourself negatively just because it happens.
Thank you for explaining that. And that is precisely the motivation behind talking about it. And if we, in today's lifestyle, let's say, today's socioeconomic structure, that conditioning becomes paramount and often stop us from realizing our potential, that what we are labeling as failure, and be limited by that stigma, avoidance. Instead, what I try to communicate in this podcast is that let us open up about it. Let's see what is it that we are impacted by, and be objective about it. And then it will be a lot more easier for us to process failure. So thank you for explaining that. And the reason for asking this question to my guests, so that anyone listening to this conversation, anyone watching this discussion, feel that, nobody is alone in their failures. Everybody fails. It's just our ability of processing that failure that makes this difference. And I believe with the human experience that we bring in this podcast, it definitely is speaking to people, and then it is helping them to be enriched by the collective knowledge and experience. Today, we will talk a lot about mental health and mental health matters, and we will try to link that back to the core theme that we started with. From your experience, I want to hear from you, and this can be a very long-winded answer as well, that where do you see some of the key challenges are in building that awareness? So you are working on it and you are telling people to be curious, to be compassionate. And I wanted to hear from you that what are some of the broad level areas where you think we are lacking that maturity, lacking that understanding, and where we need to work through?
Starting at the societal level, the attitudes and the values that tend to be transmitted between generations and between communities, I would say that a major problem in being accepting of our failures in the mental health space is that we often don't have a particularly precisely constructed understanding of the importance of the different aspects of mental health. And we don't have a very precisely constructed understanding of how we should relate to failure as a phenomenon itself. And what I mean by that is that there are too many stigmas from different philosophies that still plague the system. So the most basic stigma is the stigma that mental illness in itself creates a value problem in the individual. There is still a long-standing stigma that thankfully has abated now, but in some communities in certain parts of the world, it still survives. There is a stigma that a person with a mental illness or a mental health problem is somehow less than, they're somehow weak or feeble or less complete perhaps as a human being for having that problem. And that comes from a fundamental lack of understanding that it is impossible to be human and not have problems. Not everyone has the same problems. They fluctuate and they vary in terms of their intensity and in terms of the type, but it's simply not realistic to expect that somebody will be perfect and infallible. It's simply none of us is, and none of us can be. So there are still the stigma regarding mental illness, in a manner of speaking, is a stigma against failure because at its core is the fundamental belief that if a person cannot meet a certain level of natural success or a certain level of societal success, then not only are they somehow lacking in qualities, but that they also deserve that type of ridicule. So that in itself is an irrationality that plagues people. At the same time, there is also that same held stigma in a slightly different manifestation, and it's that we are often taught to in a newer philosophy, in a newer, what we could call new age thought or more progressive thought, all too often we're encouraged to avoid our failures and try to rationalize them or try to make justifications as to why they're not failures. Now, the self-care movement, I have to say, is very important, and I am massively glad that we are talking more about the importance of self-care and mental self-care and being willing to talk about mental illness and how we shouldn't stigmatize it. This is excellent, and we still have some progress to make in that regard. But what sometimes happens is we take the philosophy and use it in a way that it wasn't meant to be used, or in a way that to try to solve problems that it wasn't meant to solve. And it's resulted in us actually being unwilling to talk about our flaws and actually trying to validate why they're not flaws. For example, you may have a lot of people have heard the a lot of people have heard the catchphrase autism is a superpower. Now, I'm an autistic individual myself. I've known and worked with a lot of people who are autistic. Autism is a very broad spectrum and a very complex area of psychology because we've come to realize that many manifestations of it don't constitute a mental illness or a disability. it's a different way of processing information that doesn't necessarily amount to a problem, but in more intensive manifestations, presentations, it can be a problem for the individual. It can make it hard for them to adapt. Now, when people say autism is a superpower, that can have a number of different meanings. One of them is that sometimes that brain type can allow you to do things that would be difficult to do if you didn't have that brain type. For example, concentrating for long periods or being able to remember large amounts of information that can come in useful in the pursuits that you choose. But what can also sometimes happen, and again, measuring how often this happens is really hard to do objectively, but I suspect that it happens sometimes, is that it can also potentially be a subtle way of avoiding that sometimes being in that state can actually have problems. And instead of encouraging people to say, I'm not perfect, but no one is, there's no reason why I should shame myself and there's no reason why it should be shamed. Instead, it has a subtle message of just call it a superpower so that you don't have to acknowledge that there are actually problems, that you actually have problems or that you actually have imperfections. And that is it's a really fine line to walk, but I argue that neither of those attitudes, shaming oneself or trying to rationalize away flaws, are really constructive, because if you try to forget that you have flaws and deny them, you're just going to feel further shame and potentially make whatever problems you have worse. But if you try to ignore flaws as if they're not flaws or as if you're perfect and it's not causing a problem for you, either you ignore opportunities for growth or you can still foster further shame that way. So I would say a more healthy attitude that people could have is accept that you have flaws, work on them when you can, but if you have flaws that you can't change, we have to be willing to accept as a society that's who you are. And if you do the best you can and you can't do any more, then it's not fair to expect more. This is something that a conversation that I have with a lot of individuals who have disabilities. They will try their best every day to be a better version of themselves to try and overcome the challenges associated with their disability. And their personal motivation and the drive that they have is incredible, and they do great things on account of it. But at the same time, unfortunately, our medical science at the moment just doesn't allow for a lot of those problems to be overcome completely. It doesn't stop a lot of people from trying to be better versions of themselves, but also we have to accept as a society that we should also make accommodations for those individuals, because ultimately, if they can't change it, then it's not fair that they get excluded when they could be included. So I would say there's all sorts of stigma that still remains around mental health and its association with failure. And I would say ultimately, I think the healthiest attitude is own your flaws. You don't have to deny that you have flaws, but at the same time, society should destigmatize having them, so that if you do have a flaw, you feel the drive, you develop the drive to work on it. And if you can't change it, then that's not your fault. There has to be a point at which you say, I've done my best. Anything that goes beyond this is not possible right now. I'll just continue to do my best, and I'll make the most of what I have to do. And hopefully when society catches up, we can make that a little bit of an easier process for people.
That is very beautifully articulated. I wanted to break down that perception of stigma a little bit more. And the way I try to view this is okay, there can be people in three sort of broad areas. So, someone who is suffering through a mental health challenge, and then people close to them who are supporting people with mental health challenges. And then there is that bigger community who are not affected and who do not understand what someone suffering or someone caring for is going through. And I feel that this understanding or this clarity or this compassion that we are talking about, it comes in different shapes and forms depending on where you belong in this whole spectrum. Because someone who is going through a mental health challenge, who may not be able to articulate what their problem is. Then someone who is supporting someone, a loved one with a mental health challenge, they do not know what is needed from them and they might burn out in that whole process. Someone outside may be able to view the people who are supporting as not understanding what they are going through. So that awareness we are talking about is in different sort of areas. And I wanted to hear about your experience on this. What is it that we can improve upon? What is it that we should be aware of? If you could, because you are working in this space professionally, you'd have a better insight than me into this. And I wanted to hear your experience.
You're absolutely right that awareness does manifest in different parts of the community depending on what position someone takes in terms of their experience and how they are related to others. I would say that, first of all, we need to synchronize our understanding of what mental health actually means. And I think it should be more widespread and consistently transmitted knowledge. The reason being that anyone can suffer a problem at some stage, and having that knowledge allows them to handle it. But also, anyone at any stage could be experiencing a problem, and having that knowledge allows you to then transmit that knowledge to them and help them. But what we really have to understand is that there's a certain shallow quality to a lot of what we transmit, especially nowadays where we're living in times of excess and the emphasis on how we live our lives is on quantity rather than quality. And we're encouraged buy more, spend more, earn more, own more, use more social media, be more connected, so to speak, electronically, being constant consumers of content, information. And the emphasis in all of these schemes is really on quantity, but it's not really on quality. And so a lot of our mental health awareness comes from popular media, whereby the design of the content is purely to harbor engagement. It appeals to what the creators know people will connect with emotionally, and it's meant to stimulate it's meant to stimulate further consumption, really. But all too often, it doesn't really harbor understanding. Emotions are important, but they need to be connected with understanding. A person needs to have some cognitive understanding of what exactly is the issue at stake here. How does it work? And I found, unfortunately, that this was also the case in academia, which has probably been the case for longer than social media has existed for a long time, that we tend to describe mental health in very shallow terms, in terms of for example, what is it like to have depression? Depression involves feeling sad, feeling hopeless, feeling anxious about the future, or if anxiety is present, which it often is comorbid with depression, then it can be involve feeling anxious about the future. What does having trauma feel like? And we talk about triggers, but very seldom do we represent that when we have those problems, they're not just bad feelings. It has effects on how our brains process information. It affects our feeling of safety in the world, and that feeling of being threatened is one of the key factors that actually prevents us from taking action. It affects our ability to undertake even basic tasks, but because our brain is so overwhelmed with the experience of the problem itself. And to solve that problem, it's not a simple matter of changing the way you think. It's a matter of actually deliberately taking specific actions that help your mind to rehabilitate after having had that experience. And that type of understanding goes far beyond just negative or disturbing thoughts and feelings. And teach enough, we don't teach people enough to make the connection. And that not only does it actually preclude people from actually advancing their understanding and actually helping themselves and others, but it also fuels the debate that is had with people who are trying to claim that mental illness isn't real, because when you have such shallow explanations, it's easy to make shallow arguments in response to them. If you give people tight and well-constructed information that is quite concise and quite easy to test for yourself, it's much harder to dispute it. And if we are to accept that mental illness and mental health problems are real and deserve compassion, then we first of all have to all have a synchronous understanding. And so I would say that making that type of concise and very well explained understanding more available, and for all of us involved in the space to take more responsibility for spreading that would be a massive help, because it would mean that every person who concerns the issue would have access to that information, whether you're a carer, whether you're an individual who's having the problem yourself, whether you are someone who's not involved in the issue at all. If we all have that basic information, we may all encounter a moment at some time in our lives in which we may have to use it, and having that available to us would be massively invaluable. And that would be, I'd say, that the main, other than the obvious logistical issues, I would say that would be the main issue of understanding that we should try to advance if we want to make the most of this situation.
Thank you. And your response has created two segues in my
Yeah.
mind to explore. Let me share both. So, one of the most beautiful books I have read in mental health and emotional intelligence space is How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. One of the key concepts that came in there is the short-lived aspect of our emotions, that I think we were briefly talking about it in terms of content consumption and things, that it's good that we are talking about mental health, but that awareness need to sit very well with people in those different sort of broad areas because of the short-livedness of our emotions. There's so much information in our world of social media. People get sucked into it, get trapped into it, and they do not validate that in light of clarity or curiosity and questioning them. Do you think that there are misinformation out there that people need to be aware of? For example, we talked briefly about autism, briefly touched upon depression. And in our media today, it is flooded by information. And one of the things I try to do in this platform is that create right information, create authenticity, and create awareness. I feel that misinformation is a challenging aspect in terms of social media and common understanding. We are talking about it all right, but because there are misinformation out there, then we are not trying to separate it out in our mind. I wanted to hear your experience on this. You can talk about both aspects. One is like consuming information, and the other part is what is the misinformation that we should be looking at, if there is any in your view.
In terms of consuming information, you're absolutely right that emotions are very short-lived, and one of some of the key qualities of emotions are that tend to happen rather they happen rather quickly, they happen rather automatically, and at the same time they're quite intense. They create a visceral experience for the person having them, and they have a purpose, and that's why it's so important to really honor them and have emotional intelligence, because emotions are internal signals. They're nature's way of allowing us to know when to attune our attention to certain events. For example, happiness allows us to enjoy what's good, and it also allows us to it provides a motivation to keep doing what is good for us. Feeling anxious or upset by something allows us to be aware of things that might be a danger to us. Now, if we lived in absolutely perfect natural conditions, that would be ideal, but because of all the institutions and different inventions that have evolved from humanity over centuries, often our emotions are now responding to things in ways that they weren't designed to. And this is why when we're consuming content, we're often very stimulated because the content is appealing to our emotions by effectively trying to mimic natural events. But the way that we respond to that content isn't particularly helpful because the content itself is not something that has much of a constructive role in our lives. So knowing what someone else ate for lunch is not necessarily, it's not going to add much to your life. Any, what would be more helpful is if you were actually talking to people about cooking and then actually cooking together. But just having content that gives you short, sharp facts doesn't actually provide much value. And at the same time, when content is designed to make you aroused and actually make you want to react in an agitated or irritable fashion or debate people, that's not particularly helpful either, because often what stimulates it is the way that it responds to your immediate emotional biases. And often what results from that is a lot of division and a lot of conflict between people. That doesn't solve any problems, but it allows the content to flourish, because the more people engage with something, the more it stimulates the demand for it financially. So our emotions do have a natural purpose, but what content does is it effectively exploits something that we are vulnerable to doing in ways that is not particularly helpful. Emotions are there to signal things and to direct our attention towards things in the environment and towards ourselves, but stimulating them through media that is quite shallow and doesn't actually add much value to our lives, we're basically becoming intoxicated by the emotions. It's very much in the same way that drugs have an effect on people. When you take a certain narcotic, the narcotic actually replicates a natural process in the body or in the brain, and then the body starts to react as if the brain was doing it. But because the brain's not doing it and it couldn't do that, it couldn't do what the drug does by nature, our functioning becomes unhealthy as a result of it. In terms of misinformation, yes, there is plenty of it, and I would say that it doesn't just come in the form of blatant lies. Blatant lies are one type of misinformation, but another type of misinformation is that which doesn't directly state something that is not a fact, but rather it's designed to make people believe certain ideas without directly stating them. A good example of that is often seen in the media when particular journalists, especially political journalists and social commentators, they will take a particular issue and they will state an opinion on it, but they'll state it in a way that they know is going to inflame people and make them believe things that are not true. Because often what happens is we take an idea or a feeling and then we extrapolate from it, and what we arrive at is actually often completely different to what the precipitant was. So, as an example, if a particular journalist is talking about a particular issue and they refer to a particular figure who is involved in that issue, they might say, I don't mean to insult this person, but, and then go on a long rant about why they don't like that person. Often what's going to happen is people aren't just going to hear the rant, they're going to hear justification for hating that person. Then they're going to come up with all sorts of reasons in their mind as to why that person is worth hating. Often those ideas will be direct lies, but the person who started it wasn't actually telling direct lies. People extrapolate and interpret them from the response that they see. They effectively form an emotional connection with the other person and they start to extrapolate ideas from that emotional connection. So that's a more subtle type of misinformation whereby people start to believe unhealthy or unhelpful ideas without being told them directly, but they interpret them. And really, combating both types can be done in a remarkably similar fashion, but it's probably least effective to try to. Actually, I'd say directly giving people facts is helpful, but by giving people facts, you're not actually teaching them to solve the problem. You're trying to give them a short-lived solution to a long embedded problem. The more effective way I would say to solve that problem is to teach people critical thinking and teach them why they tend to respond to media and content the way they do, and then teach them how to discern quality information from not so quality information. But in terms of combating misinformation directly, one of the biggest challenges is that it is almost impossible sometimes to discern exactly what the quality of a source is, because all too often, when a particular source gives misinformation, or whether it's by implication or whether it's by blatant lying, there there is going to be a counter source. Oftentimes, that counter source has a particular authority. And what happens often is people see the authority and they assume that that means that the source is credible. And they develop that mental shortcut as a habit without realizing that a lot of the credibility that we assign to certain people and certain groups is actually socially constructed, meaning that it can be misused. It doesn't inherently have value more than we give it, but it can be misused and it can be basically used to fool you into believing someone when they don't necessarily have the right intentions. A good example was historically, it was considered scientific fact that being of an ethnicity other than Caucasian and being homosexual were things that were ultimately going to hurt you and made you basically of less virtue than people who were part of the Caucasian mainstream. And there were scientists who would absolutely say that, and people assumed, well, if you've been to university and studied for 4, 5, 6 years, surely you wouldn't have done all that work to lie to the public. What you've said must be true, but it wasn't true. People lied. And if you're someone who doesn't understand the facts about that particular subject yourself, how is a person meant to discern between a credible source and a not so credible source? So it's a tough problem to navigate, and I would say that at this stage, the better solution, rather than just trying to tell people the facts that you want them to believe, teach them how to discern, teach them how to recognize when a source is trying to persuade them, teach them how to recognize what the motives of that source may be, and then teach a person how to find credible information. If they apply that same problem solving process to other sources, it's not perfect, but they're probably more likely to learn how to actually research and think critically, because all too often what we do when we try to combat misinformation is give more misinformation. So I think the problem solving skills themselves are the most valuable tool against it, not necessarily just trying to solve the problem in the short term, but giving people the tools to solve it in the long term.
I cannot agree more to this. And what we are discussing now, I wanted to overlay that with ideas about our nervous system. As in, you said it beautifully that a lot of content and hence information is layered so that it incites that excitement, that arouseness in people's mind, which could be counterproductive for our parasympathetic nervous system to kick in and be rational, be mindful about that. So, what essentially you're saying that if we are mindful, we'll probably not be affected by it. But instead, we are going down the track where we are consuming the information as what they are and then getting part of that void, keeping the brain always stimulated. And that is driving us in an unhealthy sort of a position, which links back to what we previously said that the self care is so much important in understanding today's mental health spectrum. Absolutely agree with you on that. And I recently did a wonderful series, wonderful episode with a psychologist. That was my second episode with her. It hasn't come out yet, but we covered five key aspects of misinformation. So picked up some of the things, some of the terms that get shared in terms of content, but they are not accurate. They are psychologically they are not accurate, and it is very important for people to know what is the right information as opposed to we're talking about mental health awareness, but what we are doing is we are consuming content which might not be accurate. So thank you for explaining that. I can totally agree with the explanations you mentioned. And this is very important for us to understand that self-care at our own level. Of course, there is help and support and medical aspects of it, but I strongly advocate that the mental wellness practices can start at our own level at with very simple details, and which is something I believe this podcast helps. I wanted to hear your ideas in that space, that if there is anything you would like to share. One of the very important things we just touched upon is consuming content, consuming information. In terms of emotional well-being, in terms of mindfulness, in terms of self-care, is there anything you would like to share from your experience? What is it something you recommend to people you work with?
Absolutely. When I'm working with people therapeutically, my clients and I focus on what they bring to therapy. So my work tends to be quite focused, and we select specific goals and strategies based on the client's individual needs. I can say that there's a philosophy of basic self-care from which I draw, and it actually starts before we talk about mental illness, because mental illness is one part of mental health, but even for people who don't have an illness, self-care of the mind is still incredibly important. And a lot of basic self-care may seem unorthodox because we haven't really been taught it properly, but it actually, while it may seem rudimentary, actually does a lot for us in terms of our mental well-being. Some of the most basic pillars of good mental self-care to me would be, first and foremost, being introspective and knowing why our mind does what it does. So when we have certain feelings or certain thoughts, understanding what they're trying to tell us. And there are habits that evolve from that understanding. One of them is being deliberate rather than impulsive. We are very much conditioned to act as quickly as possible because we are bombarded with information and demands from our environment and from other people. Develop a habit of being quick rather than considered because we're learning that's necessary for survival, but it's not necessarily in our best interest individually or societally. So I would say practicing deliberate and critical decision making is incredibly important. At the most basic level, the way that you organize your daily life and the way that you organize your day-to-day activities, if you actually plan that rather than just allowing it to happen, not only are you saving time for yourself, so it has productivity benefits, but the productivity benefits result in better outcomes. The better outcomes then feed your self-confidence, and the self-confidence then creates motivation to be more constructive in your life and to actually do more that is good for you. So there's that benefit. But then saving you time also means that you're less stressed about not having enough time, which then also gives you more time to do the things that are meaningful to you. That's the most basic logistical benefit. But the long-term benefit outside of logistics is that you're training your mind to think carefully, which can help you with other endeavors like planning major events in life, planning major projects, and so forth. So being deliberate is an important one. Being introspective about our relations with other people is incredibly important. And this is so important when we realize that all too often the relations that we have with other people and the conflicts that we have, specifically with other people, aren't the result of one cause. We're very much conditioned to want to avoid responsibility for things and always see somebody else as the enemy. So all too often we have conflicts with people, and our immediate explanation was it's the other person's fault. One of the most common problems we encounter on a daily basis, that is. If we learn, however, to understand that often in conflicts, no one is really to blame in the sense that there was no malice intended by either person and that we simply made mistakes. And we learn to recognize when we're being reactive, we can then segue into being being more compassionate in our responses. And if every person does that, we allow our brains to process the conflict more effectively so that we're thinking more about what we can do about the problem and not who we can blame for the problem. And that approach, which is very simple in theory but takes a bit more practice to actually implement in reality, could have solved so many problems throughout history. It's not even an exaggeration. It would have been history would have been a lot different if people knew how to do that. So being deliberate and being conscientious of our relations with others, I would say seeking meaningful activity in life is another great pillar. What's meaningful can change between people, but all too often we suffice with pleasures that or activities that bring us simple pleasure rather than thinking about what has long-term meaning for us. And this is why people often turn to alcohol or turn to drugs or turn to addictive behaviors because often when life gets stressful, one of our basic instincts is to try to avoid the anxieties. Oftentimes we just try to forget them, but sometimes we take it too far and we end up doing things that are effectively stifling our cognitive processes and our creative juices, our creative capacity. And even more so, sometimes we do things that harm our bodies as well, like using drugs or taking risks that we weren't really meant to take. So I would say do values based work. In other words, look into yourself and ask, what do I really want from life? And then, and also what's important to me, and seek the activities that are ultimately going to allow you to benefit from those. I'd advise everyone to try to value the people around you because people are one of our most important, really our biggest treasure. The people around us can love us in ways that success, fame, money, and possessions can't. Having those connections with people has massive benefits for everyone involved, and it's really the only way to achieve that virtue. And even though meaningfulness can be somewhat subjective, I think what draws all meaningful activity together is that it actually challenges you to be a better version of yourself. So it makes you think, it makes you feel, it makes you excited to want to try more and to stretch yourself. And ultimately, I think those types of pillars that I've described, a lot of the basic self-care that we can all do to facilitate good mental well-being as a basis is drawn from that. And at the same time, a lot of the therapeutic approaches that I might use with a client are drawn in some way from those philosophies as well.
That is very true and very beautifully explained. I think today we were able to get into some very interesting aspects of awareness. What is awareness? What is it that we should be aware of? And what is it we should be mindful about? And where does our well-being practices start? And I like that. And thank you for all the inputs. In the interest of time, I was thinking maybe we stop here and then continue this discussion in a second episode, and then we explore this conditioning, this awareness a little bit more to the next level. One of the very important aspects you touched upon was the goal orientedness in therapeutic approach. It can be a topic on its own, that when do we seek help? What is it that we are asking for help on? And how do we work towards that? Because I think that works very differently from one person to another. It would be impractical to say that, okay, this worked for me and this would work for anybody else. It can, we need to understand that in a lot more details. How do you feel about it? Should we conclude our discussion today and explore this in a little bit more details?
Thank you. I'd be very much, it'd be my pleasure to continue.
Wonderful. To sum up today's discussion, I'll just go back to our core theme of Fail With Me. And you said something really beautiful, and I wanted to conclude our episode today on that is human connections. And that can give us support and resilience in many ways that we would otherwise not think about. And one of the reasons I started this Fail With Me segment was that when I was going through a difficult phase myself, and I looked for support in material around that, literature around that, what I could come across was these are 10 steps to success. So you're doing this wrong, and this is what you need to do to get this right. And while I was suffering, I felt that I did everything at my power, or I did everything that was true to my values to come out of it. So I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, which is why I felt that the narrative of success or that construct of success and well-being was not not empathetic enough to bring people on board in that journey. It is very easy to say you're doing this wrong, but it is very important to be compassionate about it and say it is okay to fail and then come out of it. And I wanted, and that's why, like, I wanted to flip that narrative that I do not want to talk about success. I want to talk about failure and then go from there. So that is why how I wanted to wrap up today's discussion in terms of like when someone is struggling, when someone is going through a difficult phase, it might be hard to accept the conditions and accept the immediate steps to come out of it. How do we go easy on ourselves and how do we come out of it? What are some of your takes? And then we can continue the follow up in a second episode.
Yeah, certainly. So you'd like me to give some input
Yeah,
on that question, yeah?
yeah.
If you are subject to failure, which we all are, coming out of it does vary between people, but I would say the two main pillars of it are, first of all, acceptance through the exploration of the human experience and understanding that it's impossible to live life without failing. Acceptance that we are going to fail and that if we want to actually try hard at anything and actually put effort into life, then we're going to fail because a lot of life involves trial and error in order to find success. There's no perfect process for anything in life. So we have to be willing to fail if we want to try to achieve anything. But how to really overcome it is to be able to look at it with from a cognitive perspective rather than an emotional one. Emotions are important, but we have to realize if you want a different result, then you have to be willing to ask, what was it that went wrong and why did it go wrong? And what can I do to stop that from happening again if it's within my power? And break down the event into manageable components and then ask yourself, what can I do to change each component? And if you do that step by step and try to focus on one component at a time and build a platform on that rather than trying to do everything at once, then you are far more likely to overcome the effects of failure if you perceive that you have failed and wish to find success.
That is very perfect conclusion for our discussion today. And I'd like to thank you once again for taking the time and talking to Stories and Stanza and anyone who was listening to this conversation on YouTube or any audio podcast platform. Kindly follow us in your preferred podcast platform or YouTube so that we can keep creating more meaningful discussions for you. Thank you once again, John.
Thank you, Abhra. It's been a pleasure to be here.